Today on The Record, we'll be discussing the rights and freedoms we enjoy in South Africa as well as on the rest of our continent. Homosexuality is outlawed in at least 30 African countries out of around 54. Women face issues including violence, low pay and more. For more on this, I'm joined by Ricki Kgositau, who is the Executive Director of Accountability International, and Thami Kotlolo, the founder of the Thami Dish Foundation. Thanks both so much for your time. Perhaps I'll start with you, Ricki. You're involved in a big case in Botswana around the constitutionality of rights. Talk to us about that and how, I know that it's a very wide-ranging question, but how women, and in particular non-binary people, are treated on the African continent.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nzinga, actually, for this platform. I think to give a bit of context to the question that you're asking is just to maybe help the viewer at home to understand that in 2017, we concluded a major landmark case in Botswana, which was primarily seeking gender marker change from the government itself, but more than anything, requesting a constitutional protection and interpretation on the rights that were infringed, primarily my own and that of many other transgender identified Botswana in the country. So 2017 really was a culmination of 7 years of litigation that started in 2011 at a point where I was denied the change of a sex marker that could be able to reflect me as the woman that I am. And at the time, it was premised on a lack of understanding in my part, that's how I interpreted, from those that are meant to actually implement these particular statutes of our government, of the country itself, in ensuring that then every single Botswana or every single person is treated equally before the law, and that there is no unequal treatment of any other particular person, regardless of their minority status. And as you're speaking to that, I'm very much reminded of the way in which South Africa itself has really played a great role in setting that kind of a precedence as well, with the kind of constitutional protections that we enjoy in South Africa, and the kind of jurisprudence, I guess, that's also been set with various other constitutional matters in South Africa that have really been brought before the Equality Court, before the Constitutional Court itself, that really created the kind of precedence that was able to also make sure that my case was also a success, which for me is quite important, because we're also talking about locally brewed remedies on these human rights violations, because many a times what we're facing as well is a backlash from government, politicians, policymakers who are often, I think, stuck on that what we are speaking to is an African, and that I can also address in a little bit. But it speaks to the precarious position that I think persons like myself across the African continent find themselves in. And I think that's why I also love the work that I do on accountability and really ensuring that leadership itself understands the universality of humanity, the universality of human rights, and essentially how equality cannot be something that is limited or infringed upon for whatever reason, except for national security, which also becomes very difficult at times to be able to prove. So that, I think, is quite important for persons to continuously push the interpretation of our statutes to also make sure that then every single other person of any minority status is actually protected.
Thami, one of the many things you're known for is the Feather Awards. Talk to us about that and why you decided to do that in a South African context.
I think at the very beginning of it, and I mean to date, until of recent, or the different direction that we're taking, it was mainly, created for us to be able to start the conversation or to spark some kind of dialogue that must exist within, citizens of this country, and who want to engage on issues around issues of sexuality and LGBTI rights, inclusion, different issues that were faced at different points of our existence. And I think the Feathers then looked at an award ceremony that would spark the dialogue. But beyond that, with our dialogues that we've done with the foundation, Thami Dish Foundation, as well as our partners, we've been able to engage on issues around access to services, which is a huge issue that happens across, everywhere else in the world. People complain about, having to be victimized at a point of, reporting a case at a police station, accessing services at a health institution, or, being able to engage everywhere else, whether being in corporate, whether being in private sector as, humans. So I think the formation of Feathers, one, was just an event, but in the long run was to be able to spark the kind of dialogue which we've been able to do over the number of years. And right back into what, Ricki was saying now, it's about being able to gear up and ensure that we start speaking to issues around the Constitution and, investigating the loopholes that are there that should investigate, or address the issues of the Constitution and, table certain issues around, policy changing individuals or just factors that are there for LGBTQI humans. So at its core was just a spark of a dialogue, but now, 11 years into it, is for us to be able to say, how do we get to a point where it's not just seen at the level of just awarding people or celebrating the lighter side of ourselves or the more creative side of ourselves or the fabulousness, but also sparking the dialogue, but also to look into the real issues, around policy changing stuff.
There are many issues, and there's a question about how people work together in order to raise the many challenges that you've both raised now. There's a Professor Kimberly Crenshaw who coined this term in the States of intersectionality.
Yeah.
And I think, a lot of people don't understand it. You see when there's debates online, as soon as people say that word, there's those people go again. So if you could explain that to us, what it is and what it means, particularly in an African context.
Absolutely. I think intersectionality is a very important ideal that we all need to really aspire to ensuring that across work that we do, particularly work that is meant to advance social justice outcomes, human rights related outcomes, equality related outcomes, because it's looking at a human being as not the singular narrative about the fact that yes, I'm one, transgender, two, I'm also a woman, 3, I'm African. 4, I'm a black human being of melanin skin. And all of these these identities, multiple identities, intersect in many ways where I face multiple various levels of injustices, of exclusion, of oppression, of invisibilization. And I think quite rightful that we even having this conversation within South Africa's Women's Month. And it is where you're often finding how transgender women, for instance, are not necessarily celebrated even in this very month, or the very narratives of women like myself and many others that I can be able to mention, your Barbara Murugas, your Leanne van der Merwe, who are pushing the envelope in various contexts that they're living in and happen to also be transgender, and how much they're giving back into communities, how much some of what I have done, putting myself up as a face for a litigation that was meant to really advance equality and inclusion for a greater trans community. Those women also ought to be celebrated and ought to be mentioned, and they ought to be given platform to be able to speak and tell our own narratives. And with that, I think intersectionality becomes very crucial in understanding human beings and as not these single narratives or single identity, that I come from a single headed household. I'm also a wife and I'm a young person on this continent. And all of these multiple identities, each and every one of them, when we take them individually, we could be able to look at a myriad of ways in which I face human rights violations on a daily basis. And with that, we able to I think, really be conscious about the ways in which we can provide holistic interventions and support for individuals without just looking at them as at this face value of a single identity we happen to be exposed to. And with that, I think that's a way in which we can also even advance various social causes when we look at an individual not just as a single particular face of an identity, but across the various spaces that in other spaces we gain privilege and in other spaces we lose that privilege. And it is important to continuously look at those particular ways in which those multiple identities actually affect a particular person's wholesome being and wholesome life.
How important is language when it comes to the kind of discussions that we're having, and in terms of people understanding what's going on?
Wow. I think I'm doing a project now in the Eastern Cape, and I think the biggest issues that we have is around how we define things. And I think for the longest of time in our existence as queer bodies, the struggle has been about identifying things and boxing people. So boxes and binaries have always been like an issue for humans like ours, where you can't seem to clearly define what it is. And I sat and I spoke at a dialogue at the UCT with young ones. And I think what we forget is the unique opportunity and the beauty of being able to speak about how you identify or explaining who you are and as you exist to your parents, and that being valid. So when I say to you, Nzinga, you know, I'm in love, ngiyathandana nomuntu wendoda, and siyathandana, that on its own is valid enough for one person to understand it. But I think, you know, over the years, English has become, it's not the subject, you know, it's just a language, and the language does not clearly define what the subject is. And so when you miss out on opportunities for you to explain the fact that I am in love with a man and I love this man in an English, in a Xhosa language, and whatever, that in its own is a beauty. And I think initiatives that people like Ogilvy has started a project with a couple of individuals who wanted to find new words of, you know, defining new things. So you know, bisexual people, I know they were talking about things around pelupedi, you know, the dual, you know what I mean? And so, and I think that the subject and the language have become a problem when it comes to clearly understanding who we are. And I think that different generations of human beings who grow up in different spaces in their lives and that aren't able to translate that in a everyday language. But I also think that just from the point of defining things, that on its own is a problem that needs to be addressed at length, right? And you do have to get into points where you start speaking it in a language that people understand. I mean, those issues go back to even how you guys engage as heterosexuals. If you look at, and I'm talking from facts, people who talk about, you know, sex and genders and organs, you know, you go to the Eastern Cape and they talk about penises and vaginas, but they'd only refer to them as ubaba and usisi and all those things. And I think the lack thereof of being able to say things as they are and to call them what they are, it disengages you from that conversation of being able to talk about sexuality and its existence. Okay. You know, and the practice of homosexuality.
I know we can go on for very long.
Yeah.
Ricki, I just wanted to go back to the issue of laws. You spoke about how there's specific laws that are enjoyed in South Africa. We know our Section 9 of our Constitution guarantees equality. We know that we've got the Equality Court, the Equality Act. There's a sense that South Africa sometimes plays a big brother role on the continent.
Yeah.
That's not translating into foreign policy and influencing perhaps countries like Uganda, like Tanzania, like Kenya, who criminalize homosexuality and who want to
South Africa,
who want to punish people for that. Yes. So how do you make sense of that?
I mean, this is the thing, and I think that we need to unpack the positionality that South Africa holds at continental level to much more progressive or amicable leadership and governments. South Africa is an aspiration that those particular countries wish to get to, where every single individual at country level is actually protected, is recognized, their dignity is also safeguarded. And then you also have the duality or the other side of this coin, where South Africa is also seen to be the anomaly. And by many other countries that are still much more conservative, looking at South Africa as being much more westernized than the rest of the continent. So it's always that kind of balance that needs to also be played. And it is why then when working at the level, for instance, where my organization is working at the African Union Commission, we are continuously working to ensure that then regional policies and legislative framework at continental level is actually quite inclusive. It also recognizes the marginalization and vulnerability of LGBTI persons, because many of our laws and many of the policies that even come out of the African Union, for instance, are often devoid of understanding and even protections for sexual diverse individuals, gender diverse individuals. And being in those particular spaces, it is important to continuously flag the need to have to think consciously about who is still not included, who is still left behind, who is still not programmed for. And it is why then we continuously are pushing the accountability agenda at that particular level. But I think it's also been great to recognize that when you're looking at other pieces of legal jurisprudence that's been set of late. Just recently in Botswana actually repealed sections 164 and 167 of the Penal Code that then criminalized consensual adult same-sex activity, and how we were able to use local or continental jurisprudence that's been set, some of it being in South Africa with the decriminalization of homosexuality, that was able to actually add value in terms of the case that was mounted before the High Courts in Botswana. Hence, we won this particular case now on the 11th of June. Although government is appealing at this point in time, we welcome that it needs to happen. And we understand the positionality that at times politics needs to play in being able to balance out liberalism versus having to still be conservative around African values, as often is said. And speaking of that, which is the question that you were speaking to Thami about, is around really continuously conscientizing people around this language of gender diversity and sexual diversity. And I think the detriment to us as Africans is not even celebrating and unearthing and documenting indigenous knowledge and vernacular that's been assigned to defining our uniqueness or this diversity that we are. What was an African pre-colonial Africa? How did they handle individuals who were sexually diverse or who were gender variant in whatever way? What is the process of integrating them into community? And that is something that for me I'm really passionate about, and even these kind of projects that Ogilvy and others have been pushing around finding new words or affirming words in our own vernacular, in our own mother tongue, which is very important because when you're engaging with any person, we're coming with English, and English is a foreign language. And as such, it becomes de facto that whatever subject you are communicating in English, when you're talking about homosexuality, what do we call it in Setswana? What do we call it in Chichewa? What do we call it in Bemba? And that is what is really, really important. And I think it's also a call to action on our part as people who are sitting here and others who are pushing and advancing the LGBTI agenda to continuously make and tap into existing resources such as our grandparents, such as cultural custodians who actually have certain language that was used by Africans to be able to define that which we are today, which we are using English and any other foreign language to try and define. And it is why then I believe that indigenous language in itself also is crucial and becomes a key point of being able to connect those that, for instance, do not necessarily speak English to understanding who we are. And as such, we could be able to garner much more acceptance and inclusion of LGBTI persons that way.
But most importantly, the investigation and interrogation into the loopholes that are also there in terms of the Constitution and what protects the Constitution, because I think that there are so many things that, you know, even if you look at the legal framework and the Constitution itself and how it's formed, there's so many things that are, there's so many loopholes that we never interrogate. And I mean, conversations, dialogues, these kind of projects are not enough for us to be able to get to a point where we're able to, you know, table the issues that are key in terms of us changing policy. At its core. And I think it's important for us then to start looking into that space and moving beyond just being able to, you know, do feathers and do dialogues and
so then my
things.
question from that would be, how much interaction do you have, if any, with political leaders, both here in South Africa, on the rest of our continent, in trying to raise issues that you've just spoken about?
So, I fortunately, I happen to work with a few government, you know, departments who, for instance, community safety, who, I mean, I think our primary issues exist within the safety space as well as health. But, you know, you do find instances where, you know, when you enter into like a hospital, for instance, hi Nsinga, hi, my name is Thami and I am this person and I am this kind of character and I want you to treat me. There's still that loophole that exists where you are able to say, okay, I'm still a citizen and I'm still a civil servant and I'm this, but my religious beliefs are this, and I'm still allowed to practice or to reserve my own views on how I treat people. And so I think that needs to change for us to be able to get to a point where, also you can't be sitting here and interviewing me if you have issues around discussing, you know, LGBTI stuff, because if you can't get to a point where we're discussing this thing, then you shouldn't be employed. You know, human rights are basic human rights and they are there for everyone else to be enjoyed. And so those loopholes then allow people to get away with certain things where religion comes into play, tradition comes into play, different spaces come into play, and it protects those kind of individuals. So I think there's a lot that happens. Great. I think South Africa and I think the rest of the world is gotten to a point where they're allowing us to be able to do the work that we do. But the time for us to be able to, kind of play the role of saying, yay, South African government and the constitution looks like this is done. Because if you say that, you need to establish an LGBTI desk in the office of the presidency, in the office of the premier, or Ministry of Women, Children and People with Disabilities, I think those things must come into play. Because I think the more we push as queer bodies and globally as such, the more there's resistance, and that resistance hits harder than what we're actually achieving on the ground. So there's room for all those things, and I think talk shop is okay, but it's enough.
And then I think, adding to everything that Thami is saying, my engagement with politicians is on various levels, particularly looking at legislators and policy formulators and even implementers. Coming from the country level in Botswana, currently I'm involved in a process of crafting a gender recognition policy together with a certain collective that we have formed, including other partners that we're involved in my litigation, trying by that means to try and influence the way in which gender recognition policy can be developed in a much more progressive way, because we are also trying to meet what is now international standards around self-identification versus having these biomedical models of people having to identify themselves, like myself, that is often required of medical certificates and reports that need to prove that you are actually a woman. And that is one other way and avenue in which we're continuously also trying to engage with those that are charged with having to actually legislate. But then when you take it even into the regional and continental level, there's some work that, as Accountability International, we have a global project called Challenging Criminalization Globally. And it's a multi-stakeholder kind of approach to the project, which is bringing together not only legislators and policy formulators, it's bringing in corporate and individuals who actually are interested in using the kind of power that they also have. It has advertisers in there, we have academics, we have activists themselves like myself who are actually frontline human rights defenders, and bringing together this collective of individuals to look at the detriment of criminalization in and of itself, and how it hampers development, and how it further pushes many other persons that are already marginalized into the periphery, and as such they are unable, or we are unable, to access social services and full-on rights when we still retain criminalization of identity of individuals.
Thank you so much, Ricki Kgositau, who's the Executive Director of Accountability International, and Thami Kotlolo, the founder of the Thami Dish Foundation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you.